Okay, well, let's get kicked off. This is a really exciting topic and interesting about it with another company. We're going to talk today about modern desktop, Azure Virtual Desktop, and Windows 365. This is a conversation about picking the right option, understanding what your options are, and we've got excellent experts on the call today. So, Clarity, Chris Blackburn, Gene, and myself. So we're going to dig into this. Now, a couple of things I want to set as like some opportunities. One of the things we really appreciated and found value in within these presentations has been people putting their questions into the chat and answering those questions as we go along. So we're not only presenting the content as we go, we're also answering questions as we go. And feel free to drop any level of question into the chat. We'd love to answer it as we're going through the presentation. We have a lot of people here that can take those questions. So feel free to dig into anything that you want to ask, kind of detailed aspects of as we go along. If it's meaningful to everyone, we'll bring it up in front of the whole group. Forward to walking through some of these options with you. So let's just pause a second and kind of introduce the concurrency team that's here on the call. So I'll start. I'm Nathan Lesnowski. I'm Concurrency Chief Technology Officer. I've been in consulting for about 21 years. About 20 something of that has been at Concurrency. I'm a 13-time Microsoft MVP, so do a lot of work in this particular domain, helping advise companies on where they should move from their technology strategy. And looking forward to digging into this today. So why don't we move over to Chris Blackburn? Chris, you want to introduce yourself a little bit?
Absolutely. Thanks, Nathan. I'm Chris Blackburn. I'm our solutions architect here on the Modern Workplace team. Been here at Concurrency for 8 years as of next week, and been in the Microsoft consulting space as well for well over 20 years. Have seen the advent of the cloud, have seen the advent of Microsoft security management in the cloud, and now the big drive of customers to get away from those legacy SCCM environments and move into modern management in the Microsoft cloud as well. Next, I'll kick it over to Adam.
Hi, everyone. Adam Clifford. I'm a technical architect with Concurrency. I've been in enterprise IT and consulting for about 20 years. In InfoSec security, director of architecture and security for large org, consulting for the last 5. I was part of like the early release for Windows 365, so working with Microsoft on it for about a year before it was released. So this is a really exciting tool set. Microsoft certified trainer, very heavily certified in this space. So really exciting to help figure out how these tools are useful to y'all today.
Awesome. All right, let's dive in.
Well, don't forget about Gene.
Oh, I forgot about Gene. I did. I'm sorry. I'm sorry.
No,
Gene, you are just as awesome as everyone else.
Hi, everyone. Yeah, my name is Gene Tirthodas. I've been in Concurrency now for close to 8 months, I think, 8-9 months now. Been in the consulting enterprise environment for over 20 years. And I worked with SCCM, Modern Workplace, Azure, device management, Intune, AVD, a whole endpoint management and identity. So a whole host of things over there. So hope to contribute here.
Awesome. Thanks, Gene. All right, let's dive in. Let's talk a little bit about why you would pick different solutions. We're going to explain what they are, how they work, and some reasons why you might select one or the other between modern desktop, and then leading from this conversation about modern desktop into options to be able to adopt that in the context of Windows 365 or Azure Virtual Desktop. So let's just start by even like talking about the difference between classic desktop and modern desktop. I think for me, the biggest difference is the extent to which the device is a commodity, especially in the extent to which it's replaceable. I like to think about modern desktop as more like your mobile device and the mobile device's replaceability than more like your traditional imaged Windows Active Directory joined, there's special snowflake stuff running on it, classical desktop. And that's really this kind of first point between single device and multiple device. Let's make sure we've muted everyone. Thank you. And what we really mean by multiple devices is that people are assuming less about their device being its own unique snowflake, and that I have a variety of devices I use to access the content that I care about. Like even this presentation, I was accessing from my mobile device last night. I was accessing from my laptop. Everybody else was sharing it. We're sharing that in a way that isn't dependent on the physical device. So we start to move into this place where like the operating environment is less about a particular thing. Another part of this is this idea that we're segmenting these devices away from each other. One of the intentions is to adopt zero trust principles, that a device doesn't share even necessarily a CorpNet with the rest of the organization. And the applications it's using more and more often are internet-based. We just hopped off a meeting with a customer where they said our main business application is Edge. It's our internet browser. And that's how we're accessing the majority of our applications. And the ones that are legacy, we're accessing through RDS. It has the distinct qualities of being cloud managed, getting away from this idea that I need to be on a CorpNet or even think about being on a CorpNet in order to manage my device, as well as it's a device which is more and more, and this is probably one of the bigger question marks for some companies, is moving toward these self-service models. Like if I do get a new mobile device, I'll drop by the Verizon store, the AT&T store, or wherever, and they give me a new device, and I do it myself. Whereas legacy environments around these computing is like IT imaged it, and they dropped it off, did all that stuff, and we're really trying to get away from that idea that like IT is this super high touch preparation organization. More about like users are starting to get to a point where they can do a lot of this themselves. Adam, Chris, Gene, what's your perspective on this kind of difference between these two worlds?
Really,
Yeah, so for me, oh, go ahead, Chris.
No, you first.
So yeah, for me, like my three tenets of a modern desktop is it should improve security, less administrative overhead, as Nate was talking about, and provide a better end user experience. And it allows, that administrative overhead is just really key for driving flexibility. So, I was working with Rivian for about 8 months before they started shipping vehicles. They were onboarding 100 employees a week. We were able to deploy machines without IT ever touching them. That were drop shipped directly from a vendor, right? Or looking at, in this case, Windows 365 or AVD, being able to respond to a merger and acquisition event, a divestiture, or just remote work or things like that, where I need to scale up compute resources very quickly that allow people to work and access the data and the applications they need in a secure way without throwing a ton of roadblocks in front of them, because security rates that pendulum. If we're too restrictive, people try to find ways to go around security. But the kind of sweet spot, and this is where there's so much great stuff with Intune and compliance policies and all this other stuff, is I want largely transparent security where I'm looking at behavioral anomalies, not so much this is bad because I have a rule that says it's bad, but this is bad because it's different for that user. And that's really what this modern approach to me is kind of getting out of the way, not having those traditional barriers, but looking at everything that end user does and how the machine is used to determine what is safe and what is risky.
And I think moving away from that traditional mindset, even as a consumer of a device, a consumer of IT, not really feeling that it's, within this IT playpen or having to be necessarily controlled by IT, and that I have a little bit more flexibility on the device. I know where to go to get applications if I need it. And being able to do that from anywhere, not necessarily needing to be connected to a CorpNet or a management server that lives in a data center somewhere, but knowing that I can be anywhere in the world and still have the flexibility from an IT side of a device being managed and having a visibility into that device as well.
Yeah, and letting IT be the experts in IT and for applications, IT shouldn't have to. I should have self-deploying or available applications, but that entitlements, that list of stuff should be coming from HR. That should be a process that they're doing. Your job title is this. These are the applications that you have. I'm going to use Azure Identity Governance to talk from my HR software to Azure AD, put the right people in the right groups automatically, and then deploy the apps they need and not have to do service requests or tickets so I make sure that my machines are deployed the same way every time for everyone with the same job title, the same department, the same physical location or remote location. So it's letting IT be more agile because I'm letting HR manage the different identity side of that. And now I'm freeing up IT to be more proactive on, being more security focused or improving the end user experience and less time being reactive to things like, user onboarding and things of that nature.
Right, and to add to that, I think you touched on a good point with the provisioning aspect of that. In the old time, with the SCCM and building out, gold image and the whole OSD process, and now with whether it's into an autopilot or the AVD, if you're running even just a script, partial script, to provision new session host, it just so stark difference.
Yeah, it's a great point because IT, again, why am I spending all this time maintaining custom imaging task sequences, right? We already deploy all the apps and configs that we need. And again, that's a big benefit of Windows 365 that we'll talk about as we get deeper into that is I can just say, hey, here's your license. This is going to spin up. You're going to have the security configuration, the usability configuration, and the apps that you need. And when new stuff comes out, I don't have to rebuild my task sequence just because a new version of Java comes out. I just replace that application in my catalog or use a third-party Patch My PC, Manage Engine, something like that to do that for me. And so when I image, it's always the latest and greatest coming out. I don't have to sysprep and repackage and redo my gold image, things that are, every time I make a minimal change to my environment.
And usually those environments or those organizations that have those massive task sequences have to have that one subject matter expert that knows exactly what every little thing does. And I've seen some that get into like 40, 50, 60, 70 different tasks in those task sequences. And so if you don't have someone that has that tribal knowledge of what it does and why it does it, you're going to be in a bad place.
Yeah, and SCCM is great. I mean, I've been using it since 2007. I'm not, it's definitely a modern tool. It can be used, and kind of last point. But the downside of it is you have to make it be exactly what you want. With kind of the more modern imaging with autopilot, we're taking our everyday config and pushing it instead of trying to build this elaborate task sequence.
So I'd like to move on to a little bit of a topology diagram of what the end game modern desktop looks like. And there's a lot on this screen, so I'll try to orient you to it. On the right-hand side over here, what you have is the CorpNet. And this is your Windows Active Directory, Windows AD environment. So legacy file servers, legacy on-premise applications, your Windows Active Directory join devices all exist on this CorpNet environment. And the most modern of environments, the end game that we're trying to move to, is this idea that the end user device doesn't live on the CorpNet. It doesn't have a sort of contiguous ability to move from where it is to a device that's on a Windows Active Directory join domain. And that's because it's not very secure, frankly, when you're on that CorpNet. But further, what you're really looking toward is this idea that this end user computing device is Azure Active Directory joined. And that's where it's getting its identity from. It's not getting its identity from having to communicate with a Windows Active Directory joined CorpNet through some kind of VPN. It's able to do so simply by being on the internet. and being able to communicate with Azure AD. But it receives policies from Intune that ensure that the device matches the state that that device is intended to look like. And as a result, it then is securely accessing applications that are SaaS apps, Office 365 applications, potentially even things like cloud printing. And then we have this situation where I might have some legacy applications. And there's been two different kind of methods that companies have used to facilitate access to those applications. Method one is they punch the hole with VPN. And even though this device is a modern device, it's Azure AD join only, it's Intune managed, it's using primarily SaaS applications in Office 365, it still may need to access on-premise legacy file shares or on-premise legacy applications, and it does through VPN until such day that that scenario is small enough, and this is more attainable than you might think, that those applications could instead be accessed through a published AVD endpoint or some kind of app proxy, Azure app proxy based access. And the main reason you're trying to get that VPN removed is because we really don't want our end user computing devices communicating with each other or communicating with the CorpNet, because that's frankly how we have ransomware. So if we can start to remove that dependency, A, it creates simplicity, but B, it also applies additional security controls. So with this image up, Chris, Adam, Jean, like tell us a little bit about like what are some of the things that people should think about as they're looking at this picture?
I'll jump in first this time.
Yeah, so
I'd say the biggest one is the applications, right? And I think as we work with organizations that are looking to make that move to Azure AD joined, and moving into tool sets like Intune for provisioning, it's easy to configure device configuration policies. It's easy to configure autopilot. Typically that gap comes where you have to start looking at your apps, right? What are your legacy applications that you still need to push a fat client to a machine for? And which ones are SaaS based? And this really, I don't want to get too far into the weeds here, but an application catalog, a service catalog, that is a very invaluable tools or catalog to have within your organization, because that really does play into how your employees work. If your organization isn't primarily driven off of Microsoft Office, which most of us are, we use the Microsoft Office apps, but there are usually other applications as you get into certain industries that they need to work. And so getting those on those devices, ensure they can not only deploy properly on those devices, but also work on an Azure AD modern managed device is something to keep in mind as well.
And also, I would just say that this idea, like, really isn't too alien, because it's really just network segmentation taken to the next level. So
Yep.
instead of just saying this is my EUC VLAN, I'm only going to allow, the ports that the application servers need to reach. Now I'm just taking this as basically a completely isolated VLAN. And instead of punching holes with a data center firewall, which are expensive to run and maintain anyway, I'm going to use other things. And this compliance state that Nathan has highlighted is huge, right? Everyone knows, most people know, right, that there are certain things I can check in Intune for compliance policies, but anything I can measure with PowerShell, I can make part of my compliance policies. So is this agent running? Is this tool, whether it's Arctic Wolf or MySim or Rapid7 or whatever? And what's nice about that is even if I can't get off of VPN completely, but I want to make VPN more secure, a lot of the mainstream Palo Alto, Global Protect, AnyConnect can do SAML authentication against Azure AD, and that makes them subjected to your compliance policies. So I don't have to worry about people downloading AnyConnect, putting it on their Mac, which I've seen. While I'm working from home, I want to use my own computer. Well, as an IT security person, your questionable machine on my network is a nightmare scenario, right? So being
Mhm.
able to say, if you want to log into VPN, that's cool, but the device has to be managed, it has to be compliant. Azure Application Proxy, being able to punch or access internal websites externally without punching holes through my VPN. That is all subjected to compliance policy as well. And then, getting to a post VPN world. And again, VPN is probably always going to have a place for IT teams being able to get in and do out of band support. But for my end users, it's not a great experience. I have to launch this thing. I have to do MFA. I have to, it adds overhead and slows down network connections. Where instead, if I can just go to the same URL I always go to, or use AVD, which now those applications can be in my start bar in Windows 11 and look like they're native, without even having to go to an app portal. Again, coming back to those 3 tiers of modern work, more secure, less administrative overhead, and definitely a better end user experience.
Yeah, huge point. The VPN's never been a good experience. It's just a thing that people have learned that they have to do. So let's talk a little bit about where Azure Virtual Desktop fits into this. Let's start with just even the why. These are 5 use cases that Azure Virtual Desktop has already been making a huge dent in customer environments that we've been working in. One is the reduction of costs of existing Citrix farms. A lot of people have adopted Citrix over the years. There's been reasons for that. A lot of times it's become because the Microsoft capabilities have been non-competitive to the capabilities they needed in Citrix. But we're getting to a point where the sort of bare bones capabilities, or even the like moderate capabilities, it's not really the conversation anymore. You're getting closer and closer to really a parity conversation between what people are doing in Citrix and what they can do in Azure Virtual Desktop in the same way. So moving off of Citrix to reduce costs has been certainly one of the major drivers. Another has been the goal of improving security. If you looked at that previous image, one of the alternatives to using VPN for those modern endpoints has been to position a Azure Virtual Desktop that can access those legacy apps that's on net, but the endpoint is not on the CorpNet. So like the endpoint's not on CorpNet, but the actual legacy app is positioned in Azure Virtual Desktop so it can access the legacy application. It may be to enable remote workers. This has been a big use case for some of our larger customers that have like big offshore dev teams or groups of developers that need to be working on sets of applications that are on net. Giving them the speed and flexibility of having Azure Virtual Desktop has been huge. Many of these manufacturing or healthcare environments that are sort of light touch, specifically where they have dirty environments where they need to be, they don't want to like be replacing these devices all the time. They have these very like thin client kind of platforms or tablets, remoting into Azure Virtual Desktops. Or they're looking to improve the user experience over legacy RDS farms, and especially leveraging some of the capabilities that are available, such as Teams offloading that are available in Azure Virtual Desktop. So any of these 5, or even any additional ones, guys, that you would pull out or would indicate are some of the major reasons you're seeing?
The other thing I would just say is, and it doesn't have to be an all or nothing. So if you are using Horizon View or Citrix today, either for certain use cases, certain technologies, there are areas where their transportation technologies are better. You can front AVD with Citrix or Horizon View. So you can let it be the back end so that, again, you're not maintaining the servers, the infrastructure, that you can still do the managed applications, all that fun stuff. But you can front it with Citrix or Horizon View to get the efficiencies in their transport layer, or because it's already maintaining, you have existing use cases, workflows, whatever, that we want the cost savings of not running all the back end with the licensing, but we don't want to disrupt our user experience today. So there are several kind of mid grounds. The other nice thing about AVD, which is a big standout for is just how flexible it is, being able to do app attach with MSIX. So I can have just-in-time application deployment when a user logs in through like app volumes and app attach. So when I log into my desktop, which is in the pool, I don't have to make sure that the apps are already installed. They can connect in seconds through this app attach and MSIX method. That the user hits the desktop, they have a fully customized machine, but that it may be non-persistent, or I may want to make sure that they're using like FS Logics or something in the back end to give me a high performance back end. But I want to dynamically provision these machines, or they're going to connect to one in the pool. I don't know which one they're going to connect to, but I want to make sure they always have the same apps that are pristine every time they connect.
Yeah, and to add to that, like we're seeing the Citrix RDS, both of these, in fact, coming out of a project where we set up AVD for this. And this is a complex environment where they have a gov tenant, they have a commercial tenant, multiple regions. So it gets more complex in terms of standing up host pools in different regions, making sure that the users in different regions are there's no latency. So all this it's possible. We set it up, and the feedback was really good. That low latency.
Yeah, or if you have data residency requirements, that data can only exist in certain countries or certain data centers, or GCC, GCC high, that kind of stuff. Absolutely, great point.
Okay, let's talk a little bit about the architecture of Azure Virtual Desktop, and I'll let you guys walk through this diagram. Talk a little bit about like how this all fits together from a back-end standpoint, and maybe that's also why we start talking about Windows 365 later in the presentation. But for those that want AVD specifically, let's talk a little bit about how this works.
So in this one, typically when you have an RDS farm or we have a Citrix, the customer is managing the entire thing. Even the broker, the gateway, everything is being managed. So the good thing about the AVD environment is that Microsoft manages the whole management plane of this, and so the customer, the client, to just manage the VMs alone, make sure they get the apps customized on the build, the way they want it to look, just focus on the primary areas where they interact with. So the VMs, and then how they want the scaling of the VMs, availability, and then things like that, just on their area. And the things that are in terms of the gateway, the broker service between the AVD session and the Microsoft, all that's taken care of Microsoft on the back end. Also security in the same areas, like typically RDP, you're using 33898. The protocol you're directly making, which is vulnerable, it's a security thing where you have that port and protocol open, but here it does the reverse. So it adds another layer of security, not exposing that port. So in that's a big benefit in AVD as far as
Yeah, and you can either use marketplace images, you can roll your own. So if there are certain applications that always need to be on there, you can have persistent, you can have non-persistent, disposable. Those are all things that you can pick. And also from a network connectivity requirement, yes, this is running in Azure, but if I have a VPN tunnel that terminates against my on-prem data center firewall or my on-prem colo, whatever it is, I can still come in and access on-prem resources. So it gives you one more step of removal. So I have firewalls coming into Azure. I have a firewall going from Azure Virtual Desktop down to my data center. So it gives you just one more layer of insulation between exposure of these AVDs to the internet, which can either be done by using a downloadable agent or just by using a web client. It's HTML5. I can go and log in and access all my stuff from any computer. So if I have people on the road or traveling, or again, there's a blizzard, there's a pandemic, I need to work from home, I can do that I can give people access to their company apps and data without having them install anything on their computer or manage anything, or let them bring their dirty, filthy personal computer into my pristine environment. Right.
Right.
So yeah, so it's all about, giving people the access to the apps and data that they need whenever, wherever they need it, without, exposing my data center to the filthy masses.
It's the
technology standpoint.
take off those shoes before you walk on my carpet.
Yeah, that's
Of
all I'm saying.
and use your computing. I think it's important to note exactly what you're saying here. This is a Microsoft managed component. So that's how RDS works. You're accountable for these activities over here. Can you explain a little bit about like this whole profile management piece? How does that fit in?
So that's another piece that, like when the user, typically like in AVD, you have two types of AVD. You have a pooled or you have a personal. In the personal, you lose the benefits of an AVD because it's tied to one user, but the profile, is persistent. So the real use when you go into this an AVD, you typically want to use a pooled environment. So that's where the whole lot of scaling you have multiple session hosts, and it brings them up, shuts them down on the fly as required, depending on demand. Now, in that kind of environment, it's not persistent. That's a big drawback natively when it comes. It's not persistent. So whatever customization a user makes, it's lost when they log out. So now this is actually it was a separate company a couple of years ago which Microsoft acquired, but that's a technology to persist that their profile, the user profile. So when the user logs out after all the configuration, they log out, they log back in, they get a totally different AVD host session host, but their profile, everything is intact, it's retained. So
Yeah,
that's where that's a big benefit. It ties back to if you have hybrid identity, then the NTFS permissions on-prem that can be set so that that follows them around, and it can get granular in terms of they access only their profile and they can't access somebody else's profile. So for those kind of things, it ties back. So yeah, go ahead.
It's roaming profiles that doesn't suck is the best way I've ever heard it described, and it's nice because again, like John was saying, if I'm rebuilding, if I have a disposable VM, I don't want people saving data locally, or even if they're persistent VMs, but I need to upgrade and we're going to rebuild these Windows 11, or there's a security event and I need to massively refresh these, or I need to scale out. Whenever I come back in, my profile data is going to be stored in a different location that's transparent. So people don't know they're using FS Logics. They just see their normal Windows profile. But however I log in, whatever host pool I come in on, I'm going to get the same user profile experience. It's going to be the same.
And speaking of RDS that doesn't suck, one question from Scott in the chat. He asked about AVD and Teams audio. What's that experience like?
So there is optimization built in for Teams, Teams audio and video. So you can pass through most cameras, microphones, and it's just native, whether that's coming through the web client or using the thick client. So there's it's not available on all platforms, like on Chromebooks, for example. That media optimization channel doesn't exist, but it does for iOS, Android, and Mac. Yes, and that's why some companies will choose to front AVD with like a Horizon View or a Citrix, because there are additional media optimization or other transport layer optimizations I want to take advantage of. So it's there for both video and audio. The microphone, the camera looks like a native device in Windows 365 or AVD, and the media optimization channels are there.
Right, it's like a redirect you can enable. And when you're setting up the AVD host pools, you have different personas depending on what kind of applications. So if you have like Teams or this kind of audio visual centric application, you have a different persona for that, and fine tune that particular host pool for that environment. And if you have more like SQL backend kind of activities, then you have a separate persona, so that way.
And there are some limited, like I said, I use green screen, so I have an OBS virtual camera. That doesn't pass through because it's not seen as a USB device, but the actual camera that's plugged in, because I have Windows 365 as a daily driver that I connect to all the time. When I connect to that, my camera passes through. I just can't use my green screen software because it's technically a virtual camera, not a USB camera.
So let's move to talking a little bit about Active Directory in the context of AVD. Do you need does it connect to Azure Active Directory? Is it a Windows Active Directory? What's ADDS? Like, break that down a little bit. Let's start with a single forest, and then we can talk about a multi-forest scenario.
It can connect to, AVD can connect to either, depending on how you want it, like the identity of the device. Typically, it used to be only, it needed to be hybrid, where you needed to have an on-prem AD infrastructure, and then you have, and then it connects to that. So the drawbacks of that is you need to have line of sight to the domain controller when you're setting it up, even afterwards. But now, since late last year, we have now the capability to have Azure AD joined AVD separate, and you can still, with that, you can still have FS logics, which is because FS Logic needs NTFS permission capability, but even FS Logic now supports Azure AD joined device. They have the Kerberos AD, I think it's called. AD Kerberos is a feature there that you can enable. So that makes that possible. So yeah, it can work in both environments.
And Windows 365 takes it a step further, because not only can you have AVD, or say Azure AD only devices, but Microsoft's recommendation. Now you can still join an Azure AD VNet and you can still access on-prem resources, but Microsoft's recommended architecture for Windows 365 is what they call a Microsoft managed network that is just treated like a machine that's not on your network. And then if you do have to come in, it's either through app publishing or VPN or Azure AD proxy. So with Windows 365, you can not only have just Azure AD, but you can treat it no differently than a machine that's just on someone's home network, completely isolated network. That's an option as well that actually Microsoft recommends. But you can still have it connect to an Azure AD subnet, or say Azure subnet, and access on-prem resources. So you have additional capabilities there.
All right, before we go into more into Windows 365, I'm chomping at the bit for us to talk about that. One last part of AVD in specifically, endpoint management. Like, how do you manage these endpoints? Are you using Intune? Is it capable using Intune? Like, talk through this a little bit.
The biggest question is, why wouldn't you use Intune?
Yes, exactly.
So yeah, AVD supports Intune. Windows 365, it's a requirement. And we'll talk about that in a little bit. With AVD, you have a lot of flexibility, and it really just comes down to why you wouldn't want to use Intune. For example, maybe I have non-persistent pools. So every time that machine I log off, that machine is rebuilt. I don't want to wait for Intune to reinstall applications. Either I want Intune to, either I want the applications to be there because they're part of the base image that gets deployed, or I'm using MSI App Attach where I have a common baseline, and then the applications attaches virtual disk within seconds of logging in. So for AVD, if I have disposable pools, I would manage the applications either locally or through App Attach. If they're persistent, then yeah, I may want to do self-service through Company Portal. I may want to have it be patched and maintained through Intune. So with AVD, you absolutely have a choice how we manage them. With Windows 365, it's 100% driven and managed by Intune.
Awesome. All right, so let's talk about Windows 365. Adam, you want to kind of break this down for us? How is this the new world in the context of the cloud PC, and how does it relate to like all the different types of use cases we've been covering so far?
Yeah, so AVD is just a contrast, because a lot of people ask, should I be looking at Windows 365? Should I be looking at AVD? What are the benefits? What are the takeaways, right? So with AVD, it's a traditional kind of host pool methodology, right? I can do application publishing, I can do desktop publishing, I have persona mapping on the back end, so that I have that profile that Jean was talking about with FS Logics. With Windows 365, and this also just changed recently, it was more of a one-to-one. I assign a license, it's managed by Intune, it deploys with autopilot, so you do have to have a mature Intune environment for that. But what's really changed in the last couple of weeks is now the frontline SKUs for Windows 365. So where traditional Windows 365 is a one-to-one, the frontline SKU is a 5-to-1. I can have 5 users using the same machine, like multi-session, depending on different shifts or however that works. Just like with AVD, I can have dedicated like GPU hardware acceleration. So I can pick my sizing. So the number of CPU cores, the amount of RAM. If I need to have discrete video, Windows 365 AVD can both do that. But whereas AVD is doing more of a disposable pool or app attached just in time, Windows 365 is really more for this is a long-term running machine that I can re-provision with one button through Intune. It's actually completely managed through Intune. I can spin them up, I can re-provision them, I can require applications to be installed, I can do self-service, all that fun stuff. And it can either be connected to my Azure network so it can reach on-prem or Azure resources, or it can be completely isolated. And the biggest benefit of this is because I'm not even managing the host pools. It's just a machine I manage through Intune. The scalability on this is lightning fast. I can go out and buy 100 licenses, activate them, either upload all I do with Windows 365 is I say, what image am I using? A base image from the marketplace? Am I going to upload my own? Am I connecting to Azure AD or Azure Network, or is it isolated? And then I ask, one other policy if we're doing hybrid join or Azure AD join, and then the machines just spin up, and it's very, very rapid. So I have a lot of clients that use this stuff for mergers and acquisitions. I bought this company. You now have access to our network. Congratulations. Go either through the web or download this app, log in. You now have a secure way to do email or something like that. I used to work with a company that provided call center resources to insurance companies. They would have to spin up very, very rapidly after a big event. So just being able to say, okay, here's 200 licenses. There was a hurricane in Florida. We brought on 300 people. We're going to spin these up. So it allows me to be extremely agile as far as the speed, and it's not as flexible as AVD, but it's much, much faster to spin up and respond and re-provision. And it doesn't require really any additional expertise. If you're doing Intune today, you can do Windows 365.
There's
and
a new
that's a good point I
capability.
don't touch on is that, sorry, just that the,
No, go for it,
the
Gene.
maintenance, like a mom and pop, I mean, if you have a smaller organization which don't have a large IT team, Windows 365 is a great fit for them, because AVD still needs a lot of, although the management plane is taken care of Microsoft, still setting up an AVD, and it's a lot more technical, a lot more involved. So that's where the major difference.
But at the same time, also, like I had Blue Cross Blue Shield looking at Windows 365, they're deploying it, right? So you have it's great for resilient, smaller organizations IT, but it's also great for larger enterprise as well, where I have that more one-to-one, and I don't need all the customization, or I don't need not customization, but I don't need like disposable machines. And then also, I see the question about effective approach for managing thin clients in Intune. So there, the end client can be really whatever you want it to be. So it may be, it doesn't have to be dedicated device. It could be an iOS or Android tablet. I had a former CISO, his goal was to work 100% full-time from his iPad. This would allow him to do that. Or what's even more fascinating is a newer feature, the idea of Windows 365 boot, where I can take any machine that I manage with Intune and have it boot directly into Windows 365, completely bypassing a local operating system. Or I can say, you know what, another great use case for this is employee choice and BYOD. I'm going to give you a stipend. You can buy whatever computer you want, but you know what? It has to be managed by Intune. It has to be compliant. And as long as you're compliant with our base security policies, then you can connect to Windows 365 or AVD, and again, now it's basically just a really long monitor, right, that goes into your home. I'm going to make sure there's no keyloggers, that the security is good, but you can actually manage, iOS, Android, Windows devices through Windows 365 boot directly in Intune without having to have, fancy WISE terminals and management. You can go that way as well, but you don't have to.
Awesome. Any of these other items that you'd call out on this page, Adam or Jean, about things that we've run into with customers that they need to be aware of on Windows 365?
This is slightly outdated. Microsoft now allows you to have an Azure AD joined for your Windows 365, and that's almost, I think, become the norm for a lot of clients, where they will provision devices as Azure AD joined into O365.
The other thing is, from a licensing standpoint, for AVD, you have to have Windows Enterprise licensing, either as part of E5 or as standalone, to get the AVD entitlement, and then you still pay runtime for the VMs as an Azure resource. With Windows 365, it's a flat rate for either the 1-to-1 or the 5-to-1 for frontline licensing. I don't have to worry about automating shutting those down to save costs, which you can do, not a problem, right? But with Windows 365, it's very easy to plan for exactly what this is going to cost me, because it's just, what's the sizing of the VM? Okay, this is what you're going to pay per month, whether it runs 24/7 or not. And again, with the frontline licensing now, I can take that cost of the single machine and subsidize that over 5 different users. So again, this is great for like healthcare or transportation, warehousing, where I may have people that log in on shifts. I don't want to give them each their own AVD or Windows 365. I want to allow multiple users to use this. So I'll buy maybe a little bit bigger VM SKU, but either have multiple people logged in at once, or I'm going to do it over a shift basis.
All right. Now I want you to be aware of I'm going to skip this part of the presentation, but you can go access it yourself, which is, there's a demo site that you can go to. You can use this URL right here to be able to play with either one of these two demo experiences of Windows 365 on your own. And that will give you just a little bit of an experience of what it looks like and how it works. And to a certain extent, it's like, hey, I'm logging into a PC. But I think it's pretty interesting to be able to just do that yourself. So pull that demo site and get some insights there. We've talked about use cases. I think it's interesting how each use case, it is very centric to industry. There's a lot of healthcare that's already been using Citrix farms forever, right? There's a lot of education environments that have been leveraging low-cost devices forever. There's manufacturing environments that have their shop floor environments leveraging these shared devices. I think this is a great opportunity to look at the use cases across each of these domains and do it in a way which is more secure and more manageable than the way that these were handled previously, and oftentimes more cost effective as well. So as you start looking at this in the context of your organization, think about the use cases that this might fit today as low-hanging fruit, beyond, even the sort of the obvious of M&A and temporary workers and ramp ups and things of that nature, but all these other scenarios that there's all these places where we kind of invested in approaches to handle these users that haven't been very secure, where they're sharing passwords, where they're doing this, and getting them to a point where we can optimize their experience using something like an AVD or a W365. So let's talk a little bit about how to get started. I think these are the steps that companies are ultimately flowing through. And really, to start, you have to start with education and understanding the environment. So what I think companies that are very successful in this start with is understanding, where am I today, and defining, going back to kind of the initial diagrams and conversations we had as part of this, is saying, where do I want to get to? What does my end user computing environment look like a year out, 2 years out, and how do I move toward that as a destination that's very intentional? And I think having the IT organization focused on an end game allows you to work past some of the traditional blockers that we'll throw in front of ourselves, like, I can't do X, or I can't get this report, or this app doesn't work. Sometimes those blockers we kind of put in front of our own way that prevent us from being able to get to some of these end games. The most successful companies are defining that direction, and then they're coming up with a strategy that allows them to either do it through attrition or do certain sets of users that are very low-hanging fruit, and understand that this set's going to be more difficult. But you have to define that in the context of deep dives in education. And that's, I think, the best place to start, is understanding the picture. And then companies start to move into this idea of piloting this in this context of a use case that they know has the lowest hanging fruit, the ones that are like the sales users that never come to the office, or users that are always working remote, that most of the applications are already on the internet, they barely access on-premise apps. There's these scenarios that are very easy to start adopting some of these use cases versus some of the ones that are more complicated, which then you start powering that through attrition and powering that through device replacement, or even new users that are joining the organization, moving into full production implementations that range across some of the harder use cases, ones that you might have to work a little harder, come up with sort of approaches that they use to access their legacy applications, which ultimately tracks into an end game where the device should be as replaceable as your phone. And that's really where we're trying to get to. It's as productive as your device has always been, or more, and it's as replaceable as your phone is, that I could put them on a W365 endpoint, I could put them on a full endpoint, maybe they even have both, and they can access all the same applications in a secure, productive way from any of those destination environments.
Hey, Nate.
So before we wrap up, Chris, go.
We're not seeing your current slide. We're seeing
not.
We're seeing PowerPoint. You might want to stop and reshare real quick.
Thank you. This is what you should have been seeing.
Hey, there we are.
Oh, thank you. Missed a couple slides there. Yes. So this is our getting started. So these steps really frame up the forward movement from point A to point B, and now you can see it on your screen as opposed to the slide feedback. Chris, Adam, Jean, anything else to add to this?
Yeah, and obviously, like, if you have questions on, maybe some interesting use cases that you're kicking around, you want to see if this tech is a good fit, you want to do a deeper dive, we're always happy to connect and do demos and talk about, opportunities and how this can be used. So, feel free to reach out. We're always happy to come in and see how this tech is useful, answer questions, any of that fun stuff as well. So, yeah, absolutely.
Just want to add that you have a lot more, like, in terms of insight, Azure Monitor, a lot of things that, in addition to this, you can, it really is a return on investment for that point, right? There's a lot more you can do with this. Opens up a lot of potential.
Totally. Thank you. Okay, so before you leave, we would love it if you would fill out the form. The form is indicating that you would love to, do one of these potential next steps. And in particular, we would love to start with any of them, but I think one of the things we find very successful is to start with just education. And that's in us investing in you to help answer your questions, provide more insights, run a workshop, get you to a point where you're starting to understand how this could fit into your organization and how you modernize from the legacy state that most organizations are sitting in right now. So feel free to please select one of those items as you leave. Give us some comments. We want to improve. Hopefully that comment isn't about leaving the PowerPoint deck up in the wrong spot, but hopefully you have a great rest of your day, and we're looking forward to continuing this conversation in follow-up sessions with each of you. Have a great journey into Modern Desktop.
Thanks again.